friends. Welcome to another Before You Read lecture. This is the Before You Read lecture for 1 Kings, chapters 1 through 16. So really the first half or so, a little bit longer than the first half of 1 Kings. In this lecture, I want to provide a brief introduction to the letters or the writings rather of 1 and 2 Kings. I want to focus in on Solomon, King Solomon, and his legacy and the transition to the divided kingdom that follows his death, as well as providing a few places where you might want to focus your reading and some reading strategies. To begin, 1st and 2nd Samuel, or 1st and 2nd Kings, like 1st and 2nd Samuel, were originally a single literary work. They were written as, one letter or one composition. It was only with the Greek translation of the original Hebrew that we get the sort of separation into distinct books. And actually, in the Greek tradition, 1st and 2nd Kings are actually known as 3rd and 4th Kingdoms, and that is because they follow 1st and 2nd Samuel, which in the Greek tradition are known as 1st and 2nd Kingdoms. So it's just interesting to note that the Greek tradition thinks of these four distinct books in our contemporary modern Bibles as all a part of this maybe single story or this larger story, different chapters we might think in this larger story. And you can see even in the ways that 1st and 2nd Samuel relate to 1st and 2nd Kings, or the ways that 1st Kings and 2nd Kings relate to each other, that the distinctions sort of bleed over, and the story definitely continues as you move through each distinct book. 1st and 2nd Kings are a part of what is known as the former prophets in Jewish tradition. This includes writings like Joshua and 1st and 2nd Samuel, basically the writings that other later Old Testament scholars would refer to as the Deuteronomistic history, or those books that share in that similar theological perspective. 1st and 2nd Kings really tells of the events starting with King Solomon in around 970 BCE and ending with the release of King Jehoiakim from prison in Babylon, 561 to 560 BCE. Again, so from the time of Solomon to just after the Babylonian exile, it's a tremendous swath of time. We can put 1st and 2nd Kings in its larger context, its cultural, political context of the ancient Near Eastern world. We have evidence of similar accounts, similar chronicles of kings and kingdoms from both Egypt and Mesopotamian traditions. And these are similar to 1st and 2nd Kings insofar as they provide a list of the sort of the actions or the events of a different king, but generally they tend to be less elaborate than what we find in 1st and 2nd Kings. 1st and 2nd Kings, by contrast, while more extensive and expansive than these other traditions from the ancient Near Eastern world, is still a little less developed than what we saw in 1st and 2nd Samuel. It's also worth noting that 1st and 2nd Kings makes use of other sources, earlier sources that we unfortunately have no access to. They're no longer available as far as we can tell. But the author of 1st and 2nd Kings acknowledges either consulting or the existence or the use of these older traditions, which in this regard suggests that 1st and 2nd Kings represents a wider cultural practice while maintaining its own distinctive elements, its own distinctive aspects. As you read 1st and 2nd Kings, there's a few things that you should be on the lookout for, or a few parts of its logic, we might say. The first is there are these formulaic introductions and conclusions to each of the kings. So as a king is introduced, or as the story of that king wraps up, you're going to find some pretty standard language. Generally, this language is going to represent the religious and theological view of 1st or 2nd Kings. And so traditionally, there's going to be the name of the king, something about the king's family of origin, and really whether or not that king did what was right or not right in the eyes of the Lord. And as we'll talk about later in this lecture, the judgment about that is almost exclusively religious. It's not, did they have good international relations, or did they have good tax policies? It's, did they worship the Lord correctly? And did they worship other gods? That's really the sort of the moral center of the book, and it's really a theological and religious one. Another thing to be on the lookout in these two books generally is the prophecy and fulfillment motif. Oftentimes, we could call this foreshadowing in some cases, but a prophet or somebody will point to something that will happen in the future, and then later in the literature, it will be fulfilled. One of these is actually earlier than 1st and 2nd Kings. Scholars have noted the ways in which Solomon fulfills God's promise to both Abraham and David. So there's this God's promise, this prophecy of God's favor for Abraham and for David, and it really comes to fruition in how the story narrates the rise and rule of Solomon. There's also, of course, the frequent warnings about apostasy, particularly as it relates to the temple. It's a sort of if A, then B equation. If Israel is faithful to God and worships God alone and worships God correctly, the temple will stand. If, however, they fail to do that, the temple will be destroyed. And as we will eventually see later in 2 Kings, that does happen. And so it's another example of the prophecy and fulfillment. Finally, there are mentions of King Josiah way earlier in the narrative, hundreds of years earlier than Josiah's reign. And this is another element of prophecy and fulfillment. It's more likely than not that because 1st and 2nd Kings were written after the events that they narrate, it's hard to know if people, 200 or 300 years before Josiah were sitting around twiddling their thumbs waiting for Josiah, or if it's sort of the hindsight is 2020 phenomenon, and that the author of 1st and 2nd Kings is planting these seeds of anticipation for when we get to Josiah. The other thing to note about this literature is it really is religious instead of historiographic. It's more interested in religion and theology than it is in history. Now, that's not to say that it doesn't contain some historical elements. It certainly makes use of other sources that might have been sort of more historical chronicles of the kings or annals of the kings. But at the end of the day, the real purpose is theological. Each king is evaluated from that religious perspective I mentioned earlier, and really it's meant to teach subsequent readers what happened. It really is dealing with how did we get to the point that Jerusalem has been destroyed, our king has been deported, and we are experiencing exile. And so if that's the case, it's important for us to keep those two interests in mind and be honest about what we can find in Scripture, in this part of Scripture, and what we can't, and to be attentive to the particular ways that the story is told with that religious and theological interest. Ultimately, the religious perspective is based heavily on Deuteronomy. So, for example, in Deuteronomy 6, we get the call that Israel would worship one God, not multiple gods, not the gods of their ancestors or the gods of their neighbors, but one God, the Lord God who brought them out of exile or out of Egypt. But then in Deuteronomy 12, we also learn that they are to worship God in one place. And this becomes increasingly important as 1st and 2nd Kings develops. So one God and one place is really the religious standard that 1st Kings maintains and 2nd Kings as well. Most of 1st Kings 1 through 16, most of this section of 1st King pertains to King Solomon. And so just so you know, an outline of 1st Kings would be something like this. Chapters 1 and 2 are about David's death and about identifying his replacement. Chapters 3 through 11 really describe the ascension and reign of Solomon. Chapter 12 is where we experience this division between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. And then in chapters 13 through 22, through the end of 1st Kings, is this parallel histories of the northern Israel and the southern Judah kingdoms. And so that's really what we see in First Kings. Now, if we if we look at the first 11 chapters, we're really concerning ourselves with the rise and reign of Solomon. Once again, we get the perspective of a Game of Thrones kind of reality. There are rival claimants to the throne. There's some contest going on, and they meet unfortunate ends when Solomon comes up against them. One New Testament scholar, John Collins, suggests that Solomon's wisdom, which he's famous for, at this point is really a sort of hard knocks, a school of hard knocks, or street smartness, as he is consolidating power for himself. First Kings claims that Solomon obeyed the law of Moses and sort of had this perfect obedience to the law of Moses, and yet we have to hold that in tension with the fact that he is ordering the murder of his rivals. Seems a bit of a tension there. Solomon's reign is in many parts of First Kings and elsewhere in the Old Testament depicted as the golden age of Israel. We see this especially in 4 verses 20 through 28. It's a kingdom of abundance, of wealth and prestige. And there is, admittedly, some scholarly skepticism about this. Scholars will point to the estimated size of Jerusalem at this time and point out that it was most likely very small. And so perhaps the story in First Kings is a bit overinflated, and it is overinflated for theological purposes, to show that God has fulfilled the promises made to Abraham and Moses and David. There's also, however, a limited access to knowledge. Archaeologically speaking, we can't actually access the site of his temple and palace because it is currently protected, because it's a sacred site for Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And so at the end of the day, one of the most important things to note is that Solomon's practices later in the book and his legacy, his mixed, complex legacy, really violates some of the core theology of the Deuteronomistic history. And so we have to ask, why preserve this if it didn't happen, if at least parts of it didn't happen? And so again, his legacy, the kingdom under him, is a place of some question, but also there's good reason to believe what we find in First Kings, despite the religious and theological view that we find there. From First Kings, we learn that Solomon's rule was characterized by a number of important international treaties, some significant administrative oversight throughout the kingdom, and a significant building program. He was an active king. And beyond what we see in Joshua and Judges, where there's a lot of concern about outsiders, Solomon seemed much more open to these international connections. Of course, in the eyes of First Kings, this will ultimately not be a great thing for Solomon, but it's an interesting shift from what we've seen earlier in this part of the Bible. We can talk about Solomon's legacy in a number of ways. First, as you probably know, Solomon is known for his wisdom. The book of Proverbs is attributed to him. There's a non-canonical book known as the Wisdom of Solomon, which again purports to be the wisdom of Solomon. It's not exactly clear how Solomon gained this wisdom. Some of it seems to be sort of a genius, a natural gift, but it's possible that he learned it. We see in chapter 4 and in chapter 2 some of Solomon's wisdom. It's possible, although we don't know for certain, that Solomon started something like a scribal school during his reign, and this scribal school of wisdom might have continued well after his reign was over. The second component of Solomon's legacy is the temple. Solomon's temple is a significant moment in Israel's history. You will remember that up to this point, they've sort of had a roving temple in the Ark of the Covenant, that God's presence is not housed anywhere, but sort of moves where the people move, and can move, as we might remember from earlier stories, out into the wilderness to help with battle. And so we get this design of the temple in First Kings. It's similar to the other temples in the regions. It's about 165 by 85 feet in size. There's three main sections: the outside, or the sort of vestibule, the main room, and then of course the inner sanctuary. There's supposed to be bronze pillars in front and cherubim in the inner sanctuary just over the ark. And the ark, as it has earlier, it signifies the presence of God. If we think about what First Kings says about the temple in the context of the ancient Near Eastern world and the understanding of temples, there's some important insight. The sort of widespread cultural belief was that the temple was the place where the deity kind of literally lived. And so if the deity was present, it was thought the location or the city or the nation is safe. In contrast, if the city or the nation experiences destruction or hardship, it's assumed that the deity has vacated the temple, that the deity has left the temple. And we see some of this theology, some of this worldview, even in the Bible. Take Psalm 84 or Psalm 46, for example. There it is clear that the temple, likely Solomon's temple, is the dwelling place of God. It's sort of how the Psalms imagine the temple. But in 1 Kings 8, we get an interesting perspective of 1 Kings' view of the temple. There seems to be some tension with that prevailing thought about the temple as the location of God. The prayer asks the question, does God really dwell in physical buildings? Can God, the God of Israel, be confined to a building? And we sort of get a compromise in this prayer and in this part of 1 Kings where it's God's name that dwells there, not quite God, not exactly God, but perhaps a representation of God. And so the temple is definitely important, it's significant, the name dwells there, but wants to resist the temptation of saying that God literally lives there or could be confined in a building. The temple really has important functions. It provides access to God. The people are able to bring their requests to God. They can atone for sins there. And it functions almost like a house of prayer, like the synagogue of much later times in Judaism. A third legacy of Solomon is that of Solomon the idolater. This really emphasizes Solomon's imperfect character, not unlike that of his father David. It says that he had a love of foreign women, or he had a long-standing relationship with many hundreds of foreign women. And while we might interpret this as though Solomon had a sexual appetite that couldn't be satisfied, that seems to not be the only case, the only reason that he might have had so many wives. I mentioned earlier that Solomon had an interest in international relations, and one of the ways that you secured international relations in these days was through marriage. Marriage functioned not only as a sort of interpersonal covenant, but a international covenant. And so the reason that he had so many foreign wives, perhaps, was that he had so many international treaties and covenants. What is clear from 1 Kings, though, from the perspective of the author, is that this was not a good decision for Solomon. It resulted in his worship of the gods of these other foreign wives. And it really recalls the earlier parts of the Deuteronomistic history where there's a call for a radical separation from all things foreign because of the fear that if we bump elbows with foreigners, we're going to end up worshiping their gods. Also, Solomon is said to worship God in high places, which again is a sort of unsanctioned worship. Even if it is the worshiping the God of Israel, it's still outside of that one place that God's worship was supposed to happen in. And the result of this idolatry, according to 1 Kings, is the loss, the destruction, the failure of the United Kingdom. Unfortunately, as we saw with David, the consequences of Solomon's sin are not really felt in his lifetime as much as they are passed down to his son. And it is his son who will face the reality of a divided kingdom. The next thing to note about First Kings is the start of this divided kingdom. You may be surprised that one of the major issues at hand is the oppressive forced labor under Rehoboam. So one of Solomon's kings or sons is continuing this building project. But in order to make this building project happen, Solomon and his heirs had to conscript. They had to force Israelites into labor. It's as if they've returned back to Exodus. Their Pharaoh is now just Solomon or Rehoboam, but they are experiencing oppression. And so there's overtones of Exodus in this part of the history. There's a character named Jeroboam who is responsible for overseeing the forced labor in the north, and he rebels and eventually flees to Egypt only to return after the death of Solomon. And it is he who really breaks the bounds between the northern and the southern kingdom because of this issue of forced labor. In the eyes of First Kings, however, Jeroboam's crime is really that he promotes worship outside of Jerusalem. And so ultimately he's a bad king because he advocates for a form of worship outside of Jerusalem. One of Jeroboam's sons, Omri, who was born around 885 BCE, and we learn about in chapter 16, is really the first king of Israel or Judah to leave an imprint on non-biblical sources. We learn from a Moabite stone that Omri and somebody named Mesha are engaged in a struggle, and it employs language really similar to other parts of the Bible. Also, Omri's son Ahab is also mentioned in the monolith inscription of Shalmaneser, an Assyrian king. And there's also a reference to the house of Omri elsewhere in non-biblical literature, which suggests that Omri might have actually had a more significant place or was viewed as more powerful by other kings, even than Solomon. Even though Solomon and David are exalted, there's more evidence for Omri and Ahab and the house of Omri in the wider ancient Near Eastern world. Of course, in the eyes of First Peter, Omri and his heirs are dismissed handily because they represent that apostate area. Now, as you read, I encourage you to focus. If you want to read all 16 chapters, go for it. If you are short on time, focus in on chapters 1 and 2 in the political intrigue in Solomon's beginning. Then read chapters 3 and 4 to focus on Solomon's wisdom and his administrative oversight. And then spend a good amount of time in chapter 8 with Solomon's prayer and the dedication and blessing of the temple. It's an important moment in Israel's history, and you want to spend some time there. And then look at chapter 12 to get a better sense of why this break between the north and the south happens. Finally, what are some reading strategies for this portion of the Bible? As is the case with this type of literature, pay attention to the characterization of Solomon. What kind of person is Solomon? What are his strengths and his weaknesses? Where does he fall short? And what does that say about his character? Another thing to keep in the back of your mind as you're reading is there a biased perspective here? Is this a southern versus northern perspective, or is it more objective? What do you think? And finally, what do you think about conscripted labor in 1 Kings? What does it say about Solomon's intentions and his building program and his desire to build a temple if it requires essentially slave labor for it to be produced? Pay attention to those little notes about conscripted labor and what that says about the legacy of Solomon. I hope that I've given you plenty to chew on, and I'm sure the text of 1 Kings will give you more to chew on. I look forward to hearing your thoughts about this. Happy reading.